Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes of veteran mental health. I'm your host, Dwayne France. Let's get ready to make sure that your headspace and timing set correctly. Hey everybody, welcome to Headspace and Timing. If this is your first time listening, then thanks for checking us out. As many of you who serve know, the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal, is one of the greatest weapons in the military's arsenal. The weapon's headspace and timing isn't set right, however, it's just a huge chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my mission here, to raise awareness about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week we'll talk about different aspects of veteran mental health and interview mental health professionals that are working with veterans, service members, and their families around the country. So thanks everybody for joining us again today for a Headspace and Timing podcast. I've got a great guest here today, someone that is intimately familiar with veteran mental health. The guest today is going to be Anthony Hassan, and Anthony is many different things, and we'll get into a lot of it in a bit. But Anthony, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Dwayne. Thanks for having me, and thank you for all that you do every day, getting the word out to support veterans and military families in our communities. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the shared things. I know that you and I do share that passion. We think that there's a lot that community mental health providers can do to support the VA and some of the things that are going on. We get into that in a minute, but I'd like for you to kind of introduce yourself, a little bit of who you are, who you were, and what you're doing now.
Super. Well, I am a retired military mental health officer. I retired in 2009. But going back to where it all began, and I joined the Army in 1980 as a young person from the city of Chicago. I joined the Army as an enlisted radio operator. I served with artillery units for 7.5 years, and I served with the light infantry for 4 years in Alaska. While I was in for 11.5 years, I was able to get my bachelor's degree in social work. And some may wonder why social work, and to this day sometimes I wonder, but I think there was a calling for me. And when I say that is, I never intended to be a social worker. I always wanted to be a PE teacher and mentor young adolescents and be an example. But as I was trying to achieve a bachelor's degree in the Army, it's impossible to do a daytime internship. So education was taken away, the opportunity was taken away. And I had a circumstance that just dropped in my lap. It said, why don't you get a bachelor's degree in social work? And then I met an Army social worker. I had no idea Army had social workers. And I met him, and he says to me, wow, if you get a master's degree in social work, Anthony, you can become an officer. I said, it's that easy? He says, yes. If you get a master's degree in social work, which would only take you 1 year because you have a BSW, you can then apply and become a commissioned officer, a captain, overnight. And I said, holy cow. So you mean I can get out, get my master's in social work, and come back in? And he said, absolutely. And so that's exactly what I did. I separated from the Army after 11.5 years. I went out and got my master's degree in 1 year. I practiced for a couple years. I became licensed as a licensed clinical social worker. I applied to the Army and to the Air Force, and the Air Force application came through quicker, and I was a captain in the United States Air Force. And then I served another 14 years, totaling 25 years of service. Those last 14 years in the Air Force as a mental health officer and military social worker were extremely gratifying. I think my enlisted time really helped me understand and relate, and it was the most gratifying experience of my life. Not to mention my deployment to Saudi Arabia after the Khobar Towers, going to East Africa to help with capacity building, and then of course deploying to Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2004. And interestingly enough, I was embedded with Army transportation units and Army aviation units. So here I had a chance to, again, work with the Army. And then I retired in 2009. I went to the University of Southern California to help grow a military social work program and a military research center. And fast forward 6 years later, here I am now, the CEO of the Cohen Veterans Network, which is a growing network of mental health clinics across the country, designed to provide free or low-cost mental health care to veterans and military families, to include Guard and reservists, with the generous contributions of Mr. Stephen A. Cohen.
Wow, that's definitely a lot of travel. It amazes me sometimes how we can sum up almost a lifetime's worth of work in about 5 minutes, right?
Yes.
But it's very interesting the transition you had between enlisted to officer. I imagine there was probably some fine print that your Army friend didn't tell you about. But why mental health? I mean, it's a lot of different soldiers or airmen. A lot of different people have that opportunity. Why at that point, when you got your master's, did this appear to be something that interested you?
Well, I always wanted to come back in. It wasn't as if I wanted to leave the military. I never had any intentions of leaving. I always knew I was going to be a career person. But to be able to come back in and to be able to help as a military officer, having the experiences from the enlisted side, having the experiences from the Army, really made sense to me. I never knew that I had a leaning towards mental health. It just happened. And it happened one day. I was taking a tour of a adolescent psychiatric unit, and I said, geez, I really could help here, and I think I can do a good job. But that's kind of what kept me in the field, was this idea that, wow, I can help men and women that I've served with. I can be a force multiplier, if you would, for the military mental health system. So it just happened, but I think my experiences and background really were well suited for this profession, because men and women who wear the uniform tend to want someone who is like them or has lived that experience like them, but they also look for someone who's pretty straightforward and simple speaking, if you would. And so my approach to therapy is somewhat directive. It's collaborative, but it's also very problem-solving oriented, which is, I think, what our men and women like at times, is to be able to see the problem, figure out how to get there, so they can have a solution at the other end. And that fits with my personality, so it was just a nice fit for me to do military mental health.
Well, that's great. I do agree that a lot of the veterans that I work with and some of my colleagues work with, they really, it's the bottom line up front. Let's cut through the BS and let's address what we need to address. And so I definitely see how the benefit of the enlisted side, especially being in as 11 years as you were, would help with that.
It did. There's no doubt, especially when the enlisted folks would come in my office, which are about 85% of my patients, if not more, would come in and see that, on my walls that I'd had my Army stuff, and there was a connection. There was a connection because I think they really want to know that the person on the other side understands them, and it really, really made a difference. And I think it makes a difference in what I do today, what I've done in the past. In this work, is that I understand that perspective. I understand what they're looking for. I understand what it means to reduce barriers to care. I understand what their thinking is behind mental health. And my hope is that I can somehow change it. I can change it one person at a time, one company at a time, one community at a time. But as you said in the very beginning, trying to get men and women in the door is so very difficult. And I hope that as I build this Cohen Veterans Network, that we're able to demonstrate to the veteran and military family member that we really do understand you at this facility in your hometown, and that it's going to help you to come and get help rather than hurt you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you that I find that military service, my deployments, much like your deployments, and combat experience, provide some legitimacy and can really make a shortcut through a lot of the resistance. I personally don't believe, though, that a therapist or a psychologist needs to have been a veteran, though. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you that a therapist does not have to have served or deployed or both. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the University of Southern California's military social work program. It is to train civilians who are interested in serving veterans and military families in mental health in a community-based mental health capacity. I think we can do a very fine job of training them on military culture, training them on the best evidence-based practices, giving them hands-on experiences in clinics where we serve veterans like the VA and other community organizations. So, no, not at all. I think that sometimes, veterans would rather talk to a civilian who may give them a different perspective. But I always think that no matter what it is, who you're serving, if you're serving the gay and lesbian population or you're serving the Latino population, you need to have a cultural competency around that particular group in order to relate. And I strongly believe that. And we all know that we can learn and we can become more familiar with other groups, other diversity groups, so that we can provide targeted, competent care. So no, you don't have to have served. But I can tell you that when we have people at the front desk, when you have outreach workers and case managers who are veterans, that presence does create a comfort. But not all therapists need to have served. And by the way, we would never fill the ranks of the community if we had to rely on guys like me and you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that pairing up, as you have in your clinics, individuals with military experience, individuals with without, that you can have that good mix. I once heard somebody kind of explain it as clinicians like you and I, we're natives to the culture. It's a difference of, I could go learn German and all about the German culture, but I'm not a native German. There's still that gap, whereas you and I grew up or lived that experience, and are sort of native to the culture. And there's in pairing those two kind of things together can really help.
No doubt, absolutely. And again, we're hard to find, so we've got to train a workforce that can fill that gap and serve those that have served and their families. And to do that, we want to make sure that they're the best trained, because we only get one chance, Dwayne. You know that. It takes a lot for a veteran to walk in the mental health door, and when they do, we need to be ready. And we need to be able to engage them in a way that's acceptable, that's respectful, because they may not come back. And that's one of our challenges, is how do you create a sustaining engagement with a veteran who's reluctant to get help and tends to wait till it's a crisis. And then if you don't respond in the way that they feel comfortable, there's a good chance they won't come back. And so we have to do everything we can, and sometimes that's still not enough. But we need to demonstrate that we understand, that we're respectful, and that we're available to them, because, again, we only get one chance sometimes.
Yeah, I've noticed that with veterans, they don't really need much of a reason to avoid mental health treatment, and so any reason can be a good reason. And that's why reducing the barriers is important.
Absolutely. What we're trying to do at the Cohen Veterans Network is that if you're a veteran and you call our clinic and asking for an appointment, or a family member calls and talks about, they have someone who needs help, we want to be able to tell them, when they say, well, I can't get there, I don't have a car. Well, we'll pick you up and we'll bring you back. I can't afford it. Well, it's for free. I have insurance, but I can't pay the co-payment. We can work on that. Traffic is too bad, I can't cut across town. Well, we can do video conferencing. We can do a telehealth situation for you. I don't have daycare. Well, we can provide a daycare provider in our family waiting room. When you come, you'll have someone there to watch your children. So we have tried in every possible way, with Mr. Cohen's generosity, to ensure that there is no reason why someone who is asking for help can't get help.
So let's talk about the Cohen Veteran Network a little bit more in depth. I know that You've got a number of clinics. I think you just celebrated your 1-year anniversary with some of your initial clinics, and you're opening up some more. So what can you tell me about the Cohen Veterans Network kind of locations and things like that?
Well, thank you, Dwayne. I know I mentioned it a couple times already in the podcast here, and I don't mean to promote us just to promote us for promoting's sake. It's part of how I've been thinking about establishing this network of clinics and what I have learned and have taken from my experiences that can help inform the network's development and services. So right now the Cohen Veterans Network opened with 5 clinics in New York, Philadelphia, Dallas, San Antonio, and Los Angeles, and we have 7 more opening this summer over the next 4 months. So we have a clinic opening in Fayetteville, North Carolina in June. In July, we have a clinic opening in El Paso, Texas. We have a clinic opening in August in D.C., in September in Denver, in October, Fort Hood and Killeen, Texas. And then we're going to round out 2017 with a clinic at Clarksville, at Fort Campbell, and a clinic in Orlando. So those are the next 7. So we'll have 12 clinics by the end of this year. And then with the hope of having another 13 more clinics between now and 2019. So we're looking at 7 next year and then 6 the following year, with a total of 25 clinics in high-need communities across the country where we can serve or fill the gap or be part of, and I say part of, the solution for the communities where we go. We are not the solution, but we are definitely and can be part of the solution.
Yeah, I was going to say, it does sound like a top 10 list of military concentration. Fort Hood, Fort Campbell, Fort Bragg. But of course, comes to mind San Diego or Norfolk or a lot of, and I guess Orlando is a large multi-service place as well. But yeah, there's a huge need a lot of different places.
And absolutely, and I didn't list where we're going next, but the list is much greater than just 13. We can go almost anywhere these days and do good. Maybe 100 patients a year, maybe 1,000 patients a year. But we feel that there's a gap in care, and we want to be there for it. So surely, if I look at the West Coast, we need to be in San Diego. We need to be in Northern California, Portland, Seattle. We can go down to Phoenix and do great work there. We going across to Norfolk, going down to Miami, Jacksonville, Montgomery, Alabama, by the way, has the greatest mental health access to care issue. You wouldn't necessarily think of Montgomery, Alabama, but we want to also reach out into the rural areas of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming with telehealth out of our Denver clinic. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of places to go. And we're here with Mr. Cohen's support to be able to help fill the gap and to be part of someone's community solution. It's exciting to be able to build a network that's informed by veterans, that's informed by DOD and the VA. I have some strong colleagues who have participated in the development of the model. It's like a franchise. I go to a community of high need, I find a real good community partner, and I fund that partner to deliver our model. And our model seems to be doing very, very well. It's responsive, it's informative, and it's meeting the needs of veterans and military families. We've seen about 3,500 patients to date in the first year. And of those 3,500, 60% are veterans and 40% are family members, which I'm excited about. Of the veterans, we have 24% are women, and we think that's a real cool thing to see so many women. That's twice as many that actually serve on active duty. Right. We're serving 12% of those other than honorably discharged veterans who would not maybe have had a choice or an option. And it's just going very, very well. As you would imagine, in any outpatient clinic, what you would see is what we're seeing. So 20% of our patients have PTSD and other mental health conditions, but the majority of our men and women who present to the clinic have depression, anxiety, and adjustment challenges, transition challenges, identity challenges, so grief and loss. So it's the whole thing. And I know we spend a lot of attention and time focused on PTSD because it is a very challenging diagnosis and one that we have to treat with evidence-based approaches, like all things, but it's the one that became our signature injury for the war. But I can tell you that men and women from all walks of service and experiences are challenged as well when they transition. And so we have to be mindful that there are men and women who present with life challenges as well. So our clinic cannot just cater to PTSD diagnosis, but it has to be comprehensive enough. The clinic services have to be comprehensive enough to meet all of the veterans and their military family members' needs when they present. And so we believe that our outpatient program is comprehensive enough to meet the majority of the challenges that men and women bring to our clinics on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Anthony. It's I was actually talking to a veteran, maybe it was like a month or so ago, and he said, not a client, but a colleague of mine, and he said, you know what, I really don't have the PTSD thing. You know, he's like, I've looked at it, he's like, that doesn't seem to be me. But when I was talking about some of the other stuff, you know, things you're talking about, purpose and meaning, but when we got to moral injury and I was explaining that to him, it was like a light bulb went off. And he was like, that's my issue. That's what and he was like, I'm not worried about, I don't have TB, I don't have PTSD, I don't have a substance use issue. But what is this other thing that you're talking about, moral injury? And so I think it's important to look beyond, like you said, just PTSD and TBI.
Well said, absolutely. I got goosebumps when you said that because that's what we're hearing too. We're also hearing, look, man, I've been deployed, 5 years out of the last 10, and my marriage has fallen apart, or my relationship with my children is not as good as I'd like it to be, and I want to do better, and I want to be better, and I want to get back to better, I don't understand where I fit in anymore, and I need some help talking to somebody. And so sometimes it's almost like someone needs to have a coaching episode or just a moment where they can share some of their concerns with somebody else. And that's what I'd like, folks who are listening, who are in the service or who are out of the service, to know that, talking to a mental health provider isn't taboo. It's a place where you can actually, let some things out and get some reflection. Here's how I think of it, and I spent my whole career trying to convince service members that it's okay to get help. But what happens is, it's not that you have a mental health condition. What you have are behaviors that are causing you problems. And if you don't address the behaviors that are causing you problems, they're going to cause you real problems, like a DUI will ruin your career or your future career. Those are domestic violence situations. Coming to work late, coming to work with alcohol on your breath. These were the things that were red flags that ended up bringing you to the clinic. But imagine if you would have worked on some of those challenges before the incident. We could have prevented the incident. And so many times people think of mental health as a place that ends your career, and I would argue that it's not mental health, it's your behavior that ended your career or your future opportunities because you had unattended to problems that you coped with in a dysfunctional way.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely that's something that it can build up, sort of death of a thousand cuts. And then we as veterans, as service members, also have unique experiences on top of that. To circle back, you had mentioned that you were part of the response to Khobar Towers, and really, if we could touch on that for a minute, because that was a surprise. That was as far as I understand, supposed to be a fairly safe situation. And I've actually spoken to veterans, Air Force veterans, who responded a day or two after Khobar Towers, and it was horrific for them. And so on top of all of the small stuff, there's those big events that happen.
Yeah, so when I deployed to Saudi Arabia, it was after the Khobar Towers. So basically they moved everybody from Khobar Towers into the middle of the desert. And that's where I sat as the mental health officer for the 5,000 men and women who were at Khobar Towers. So I didn't actually respond to the crisis. I was actually the mental health officer for the 5,000 that were now placed into a desert environment to ensure force protection at the time. So my actual work was working with a compound of 5,000 men and women deployed in an austere environment. That was not a reaction or a response to the terrible incident. But I can tell you that in our experience as military mental health officers, we do a lot of critical incident responses. We are going to support our men and women who've lost loved ones in battle, who've lost them in blasts, who've lost them in terrorist acts, who have been lost in airplane mishaps. So this is very common to us who wear the uniform in military mental health to be responsive to mass casualty scenarios. And and for those of us in the field, that affects us too. It
Right.
changes how we view the world. We have nightmares and memories of hearing over and over again the trauma of others. And so for those mental health people who are listening, professionals who are listening right now, remember self-care is important, particularly when you're dealing with trauma after trauma after trauma.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that that's a very important point too. I've found that there are times where, as I'm speaking with Veterans One, I'm located in the area outside of the post that I deployed with, and so in many cases, I know specifically the areas because I served in the areas either before or after some of the veterans I'm talking to, and it can get very heavy, I guess, or impactful if we don't care for ourselves. And I think that is another aspect of the cultural competence, because if a provider's not familiar with what the veteran happened, or what happened to the service member, they can be impacted too adversely, vicarious trauma or anything like that, and that can then damage the therapeutic relationship.
Absolutely, and this is tough business. Being a mental health professional, being a clinician, serving a population that has trauma experiences, repeated trauma experiences, can be pretty taxing on the clinician as well. But the profession of mental health, as we all know, has a high burnout rate, and so we all need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves, balancing our caseload, and ensuring that we're also supported along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you had mentioned earlier, especially, and it was interesting that you said Montgomery, Alabama. You're right, I hadn't considered the challenges in some of the more, or I definitely in the Central West am aware of the remote challenges here. What are some of the barriers either that you're hearing from staff at the clinics or that you experience? What are some of the barriers to veteran mental health and wellness that exist, and what can communities or community providers do to help reduce them?
Yeah, I think some of the ones that I highlighted earlier have to do with, the clinic's not accessible, it's too far away. I can't afford it, I don't have insurance, I'm between jobs, I can't trust the therapist. So we're trying to do our best to address those. But what we're trying to do and test to see if it matters is to deploy outreach workers who are veterans. So we hire veterans to go out in the community and be a part of the community, who come from the community, to really instill trust in the clinic, to be able to discuss the services offered, to be able to reduce the barriers to care when they're presented to them in an audience of many or in a one-on-one situation. So our efforts to reduce those type of barriers, the big one is trust. Is how do I how do I gain their trust? And we think that by having community-based outreach workers from the clinic who are veterans can do that. We try really hard to work with the VA, where they have a need that necessarily can't get met in time. So we want to be able to help them as well. So we see our number 1 and 2 referral sources, believe it or not, are the VA and word of mouth. And so we believe that the word of mouth is because of our community outreach. It's because of the quality care that's being provided. So it's really, really important to have a strong social media chain, a strong media channel, I should say. But to me, what's making a difference is we have trusted veterans who are going out and extending the support of the clinic where it needs to be.
And I think that's often an overlooked aspect of mental health support for veterans is that peer aspect. The VA has started to do it with their peer support specialists, and they've done very well. I know several who are here in Colorado Springs that they're able to connect with veterans, like you say, establish that bond of trust. That peer support element is a significant aspect to breaking down some of those internal barriers, right?
Absolutely, it sure is. And I think when people walk in the front door after having an experience with another veteran, and they walk into the front door of the clinic, and the clinic is warm enough to them, or the immediate interaction is one that feels good to them, I think we've been successful. Hopefully they'll stay engaged in treatment, which I mentioned earlier is one of the barriers to care, is how do I keep, and this is true with all of mental health patients, how do we keep them engaged for the duration of the treatment? So we know that prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy takes about 12 sessions. But the truth is our average number of sessions for our veterans is only 8. So what do we do there when the total episode of care is now cut short? So how do I engage the veteran between sessions without being a pest, but to keep them engaged, to keep them motivated, to keep coming back until treatment is completed rather than prematurely terminating and then having to come right back in crisis a month later, which is fine, but we would prefer that the veteran patient or family member stay engaged for the duration of the treatment. And so one way that we're trying to do it is to continue to extend the peer-to-peer piece by having a 24-hour call center that's manned or womaned by veterans, so that if there's a situation where someone needs to talk, that they can do that. If there's a way for us proactively to reach out to our patients in between sessions, we'd like to do that. So I think, one of the things that we need to do better of is keeping veterans engaged in treatment once they enroll. And one last piece that we're considering doing, and actually it's in implementation now, is to develop a wearable where some of our high-risk patients can have a wearable on their wrist that will help us track their sleep, their activity, their heart rate, so that we can maybe detect early on if they're isolating, if they're sleeping too much or not enough, as a way to reach forward and say, hey, it looks like you're not doing so well. Would you like to come in and see us? So there are ways that we're thinking about engaging the veteran in between sessions, because it's unfortunate that they come in, they have 1 or 2 sessions, and then they discontinue treatment. We really believe that they need to stay the course, whatever that course is for them. It's 5 sessions, 8 sessions, 12 sessions, so we can have the best possible outcome.
So that's really interesting. And me, of course, not being an insider, but knowing what Cohen Veteran Network is and the work you're doing, I wasn't even aware of the staffed 24-hour hotline. Is that just for your local clinics? Is that only in certain local clinics? Or are you doing that nationally?
Yeah, we're in the process of completing the contract. So we haven't started it yet, but we're very close to completing a contract with a national call center.
Great.
That all of our veteran patients would have that number that they can call in between sessions. We're also going to see if we can get the veteran or family member to check mark on their intake sheet if we can call them between sessions, so we're not being intrusive, but they've already asked us to, that we would then have this call center call them to check in on them between sessions. We're also looking at maybe using it for the no-shows as a way of reaching back and saying, I know you missed your appointment today, could we reschedule you for another one? So we're really trying to be available to them 24/7.
Yeah, see, I mean, and I think that's great. This is an example of what community members or community providers like ourselves can do, not to compete with the VA, not to supplant the VA, but to come alongside and to really cover those gaps that exist, because they're huge.
Absolutely. I mean, and again, I have a great relationship with the VA at the central office in D.C., but we even have a better relationship at the local level with the local VA. This isn't a competition. We're really here to add value. We're really here to be part of that community solution. And so everything we do is really coming from the community, and that's why we partner with a community organization, because it really has to be driven from the community, from grassroots. All partners in the community need to be engaged as a unit to support those in the community who've served.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that especially I don't like to ask, because it's not an enjoyable subject, but that I do ask of mental health providers is there are a few challenges that are significant to the veteran community than the epidemic of veteran suicide. I know that you've seen it. I'm sure you know that I've seen it. I mean, it's so widespread. What are your thoughts on it, and how can we as mental health providers make an impact?
Wow, tough subject, right? As a therapist, eventually you're going to have the unfortunate call where one of your patients decided to take their life by suicide, and it's a reality of our business. It's a reality of what we're seeing now in the veterans community, with reportedly 20 veterans dying by suicide a day. Tragic, but it's also an epidemic across America.
Right.
High rates of suicide. I think as organizations, we need to do as much as we can. We need to learn from those unfortunate circumstances. We need to have good quality measures in place, good quality compliance, good risk management. We need to make sure we're asking the question. We need to make sure we're addressing the screener that asks if you're suicidal. We need to make sure clinicians are developing safety plans on a regular and routine basis, that the organization's culture has to be zero suicide. The organizational processes have to be wrapped around the idea that we're going to work towards zero suicide. We're going to do everything we can in our power, in our processes, to ensure that we do everything when someone comes in the door at high risk. And again, it goes to those engagement things that I talked about. It goes to this idea that hopefully we're a trusted place and they would reach to us before they made an attempt on their life. Or it's when we have that 24-hour access and someone picks up the phone and calls in between session when they're struggling, and we get them in the next morning, or we get them to an emergency room. It's the wearable, right? It says, uh-oh, this dashboard is telling me that Johnny's not doing well. Let me give him a call. So it's trying to be as proactive as possible. It's also, we're looking at data, and all the data that comes into our clinics and our network can help us predict high-risk patients. And so we can engage early in managing risk. And it's a tough thing, and as you know and I know, we can do everything in our power, but sometimes people make choices, unfortunately. But we want to make sure that we're there in a preventative way. We want to be there to intervene early. We want to make sure we're intervening with the right resources and the right tools to help us assess risk. But in the unfortunate circumstance, we also want to be there after an incident. We want to be there to support the clinic, the family, the community. And this is tough business. And frankly, your question is perfectly timed, because I am looking right now to hire someone to be my vice president of risk management and quality compliance, because it's that important to us.
Right.
I want to raise the level of care in our network of providers that they haven't experienced in their current organization. I want them to recognize that we need to do better, and we can do better. So let's raise the playing field here. Let's make it part of our everyday processes, rather than a one-off when someone says they're suicidal.
I like what you said about prevention. Obviously, the prevent with the little p, but prevent with the big P is to be able to work with a veteran or before it gets to that crisis state, so that the crisis never occurs. And that goes back to what you were saying earlier about a veteran will drop off services and then come back when they're in crisis, but it would be much better for them to not have the crisis in the first place.
Absolutely. I mean, the pain and suffering that the crisis brings, if we can only get upstream on this stuff. And, that's partly why we're focusing on post 9/11 veterans, right? We want to get upstream on this problem. We want it to be less of a chronic condition. We want it to be where we get involved before you lose your family, before you lose your job. And we're doing everything we can to help get upstream. It's not that we're ignoring the other era of veterans. We'll see them as they need to be seen, but we really have to put in effort, a strong effort in helping those that have served in these recent wars so that they don't have a lifelong experience of suffering, a lifelong experience of isolation. And so we are working so hard on making sure we can get in front of it and trying to do as much in the community to create community awareness, to make this place, the Cohen Clinic, a place, or other clinics, a place where you can come and get help and get the support you need when you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that we don't do well as mental health professionals is getting that word out, of sharing, what we can do, what we have the ability to do with veterans. A colleague of mine says sometimes we're so confident in our own product that why wouldn't someone come in, and we just sit back and wait for someone to come in. But that proactive approach that you're talking about with the Cohen clinics is pretty significant.
Well, you know where that came from, Dwayne. That came from combat stress control teams. That came from how I was deployed, how I thought of mental health. When I was in Saudi Arabia on that base with 5,000, I didn't sit in a tent somewhere. I was walking around. I was engaging. I was going to commanders' calls. I was going to the gym. I was hanging around, sitting around eating ice cream, right? So, or standing in the child line and passing a flyer forward. Read this and pass it forward. That's where this is coming from. That's where this investment of 2 outreach workers and a case manager for every team for every clinic is important in the way we think about it. I knew I was most effective and more trusted when I lived with them, worked with them, and always presented with them. So, doing the outreach activities to the unit, doing the stress management blurb, right, talking about, resources. That's the model we're trying to deploy out of the Cohen Clinic, is that we have to be in the community. We have to be talking to veteran groups and National Guard and Reserve units and the VA and whomever else will listen to us, because they have to know we're available and that they're welcome to come.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm definitely going to put links in the show notes to the Cohen Network website, and also definitely the USC program. There's a lot more graduate programs that are offering certificates for LCSWs and LPCs and psychologists to be able to provide some military cultural competence. But is there anything that I didn't ask that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, just along those lines, Dwayne, the idea that the Cohen clinics, the network of clinics, really is something that's special, because I want to take the graduate student from the LPC program or the LCS or the military social work program or a social work program, and I want them to know that we might have a slot for them to intern in our clinics. So you see, I'm trying to grow our own. If every clinic has 3 graduate students, that's 75 graduate students a year the Cohen Clinic is helping train, then we're generating a pipeline of clinicians that can work with veterans and military families, not only in a Cohen Clinic, but in the communities that they're from. And so I guess I just would like to just say that if you're a graduate student and you're interested in working with veterans and military families, the Cohen Clinic in your town, if there is one, is looking for graduate students to grow and cultivate and provide good supervision so that you can eventually help veterans and military families. So in closing, I would just say that there are graduate student opportunities in the Cohen Clinic, because there just aren't enough of us to support the men and women who've worn the uniform in every community across the country.
Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, I had a conversation with the veteran that he was finishing up his tour in Germany. He was retiring, heading back to San Antonio, he reached out to me looking for resources, and I directed him to the clinic, to the Cohen Clinic, and I said, hey, check this out. There's some opportunities. It really, because veterans who become mental health professionals, like yourself and myself, we want to work with veterans, and we want to pay it forward. So yeah, it's great to know that.
It's a beautiful thing, to be able to continue to serve as you and I are and others while we're out of uniform.
So one of the big questions, of course, and this is the question I like to ask all my closing guests, is you've got somebody listening to this. Maybe they stumbled on this show, and maybe they were listening to Jeff Adamek's Changing Hearts and Minds show, and they're like, yeah, well, why? What's in it for me? Why do I need to work with a counselor or a therapist? What's the point? I can deal with this on my own. What would you say to that veteran who has that in their mind, Anthony?
Well, Dwayne, it's kind of what I said earlier in the show, and it's, I don't know how many times I have to say it, right, in order for the men and women to hear me. And the problem is they only hear me when they are in crisis and they have to come to see me. I really wish that people can recognize when people tell you you have a challenge, when people are concerned about you, take that seriously. Don't minimize it. Get help. And that doesn't have to be with a licensed provider. You can go to a chaplain. You can go to a coach. Sometimes it's going to a mentor. You need to talk with someone about this, because what happens is that over time, the problem doesn't get better, whatever it is. You avoid it, you minimize it, you rationalize it, and what happens is your behavior eventually is going to get you into a clinic. It's going to get you into a clinic because you did something you regret, or you become so incapacitated that you can't function, and you end up in our office. I'd like to see you early. I'd like to see you when the problem is first presented to you as a problem. I want you to come see us when you're recognizing that you've got these ruminating negative thoughts that are keeping you from sleeping. Come early. That's what I would suggest. It's worth it. Because in the end, unattended to mental health problems turn into critical incidents and crises. So please, come and get help. Talk to someone. Take that first step.
Yeah, that's. I think that's really along the lines of what I tell veterans is like, look, better to come in whenever your wife or your parents might say that there's something going on. Even better when you realize yourself that something's going on, because it might get to the point where a cop or a judge is going to tell you really need to do something about it.
And by then, the problem is so much worse.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate taking the time, Anthony. I know that you're extremely busy, and your time is at a premium, so the amount of time that you've taken with us and our listeners is great. If somebody wants to reach out to you, find more information, how can they find you, your website, social media, stuff like that?
Yeah, you can find all of that at our website, CohenVeteransNetwork.org. You'll see where our clinics are, where we're going, and there are a number of other things on there that you'd find interesting. So we look forward to you visiting with us, and hopefully one day I'll be in a city near you. We're always looking to hire veterans and people who have mental health backgrounds, and hopefully, Dwayne, one day you and I will be able to work closer together as well.